Fine. Well, it is my pleasure to introduce our next speaker, Nick Spencer. Nick works for Theos, an organisation you may have heard of. They are there to stimulate the debate about the place of religion in society. And Nick is particularly well known for a radio series which he spoke on in the summer of last year, entitled The Secret History of Science and Religion. He's done much more beyond, and today he's going to talk to us about science and religion, the culture war, ? Nick, over to you.
Thank you, Hugh. Good morning, everybody. It's a real pleasure to be here. I get the vague sense that this talk's been kind of talked up quite a bit. So I would like to say right from the off, if you do have any difficult questions, I will take them and then duly pass them on to Keith, who's speaking after lunch. As you said, I'm Nick. I'm Senior Fellow at Theos. Theos is a Christian think tank. We've been going almost exactly, we were founded in 2006. Is that? Yeah, so almost exactly the same time as the Faraday Institute. And in short, we exist to tell a better story about faith in general, Christianity specifically in contemporary public life. Better in the sense of more accurate, because there's an awful lot of misinformation flying around. So research is at the core of what we do. But also better, hopefully, in the sense of more attractive, more appealing, more engaging, more winsome. We engage over a number of areas, and about 10 years or so ago, we partnered with the Faraday Institute to do a big project on the Darwin anniversary, 2009, the 150th anniversary of the publication of The Origin of Species, simultaneously the 200th anniversary of Darwin's birth. Darwin, as I'm sure you will be aware, had become the poster boy for thinking atheists, quite illegitimately, so we argued, not least what Darwin himself came to believe. So we did various research projects, and I wrote a little kind of, as it were, spiritual biography about Charles Darwin in terms of what he believed and why he stopped believing it and what he came to believe. And I'd had a kind of long-standing interest in science and religion, but that was a great project to work on, and it spawned various different other things. I debated with Steven Pinker from Harvard University last couple of years ago on did Christianity birth the scientific revolution? And then, as Hugh mentioned, I got the opportunity to present a 3-part series on the secret history of science and religion on Radio 4 last year. It's not secret to people who work on the history of science and religion in the academy. And indeed, it's not secret to, I think, people who followed the debate and have read people like Peter Harrison and John Hedley Brooke. But it is secret to an enormous number of people who believe that science and religion are in conflict with one another, fundamentally, irreducibly in conflict with one another. And there is a temptation when you're presented with that narrative to go right to the other extreme. So no, they're not. They're absolutely not. And then someone points out the fact, well, 39% of evangelicals in the US believe in young earth creationism. Figures vary, but it's roughly that. That sounds pretty conflictual. And there's every sign that the level of evolution rejection is increasing across the world. Stephen Jay Gould wrote in the 1990s that, America's a bit weird. It's only going to stay here. And of course, it hasn't only stayed there. And it's also the rejection of evolution has spread very significantly in the Islamic world, in as far as we're in a position to tell. So it's complex. And John Hedley Brooke, who wrote a very fine book in 1991, rather sort of anemically called Science and Religion, Some Historical Perspectives. I wonder what his publisher thought about that particular title. Some Historical Perspectives. It was a real ground changer, really, and it pointed out that the warfare, the metaphor, is fundamentally wrong. But you don't simply replace it with a harmony metaphor or a peace metaphor, and he replaced it with a complexity metaphor, which does what it says on the tin, but unfortunately doesn't kind of get the blood stirring in the same way as warfare does. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the culture war, in inverted commas, between science and religion, and where it comes from and where it is today and what it really means. I think, loosely speaking, there are 4 categories of books on science and religion. This isn't an exhaustive categorization, and it is as alliterative as any good Anglican sermon should be, but I think it's a helpful way of looking at it. There are descriptive books. There are books that simply seek to describe in as neutral a way as possible And of course, complete neutrality is impossible in these disciplines. What has the history between science and religion been, and what is the nature of that relationship today? As well as descriptive, there are dismissive books. There are ones that say there is no dialogue between science and religion because, according to Eve Gingras, it is an impossible dialogue. Or Jerry Coyne, science and religion are incompatible. Richard Dawkins needs no introduction, but by far and away the most influential of all of those books is the third one along, which you're very unlikely to have read, John William Draper's History of the Conflict Between Religion and Science. It was first published in the 1870s, hugely influential, and it was the book that cemented warfare or conflict as the controlling metaphor. Somebody asked earlier, where did this conflict originate? And I'll talk a little bit more about that, but it's a late Victorian or late 19th century invention. Then there's the discursive. So these are books that are obviously much more compatibilist in the way that they understand the relationship between science and religion, and argue that there is a fruitful and mutually beneficial dialogue, discussion, to be had between science and religion. Doesn't mean you're necessarily going to iron out all the tensions, but they do have something to say to one another, and each party in this conversation benefits from listening to that conversation. And there are some very good books there, and many of them are on the bookstall at the back. But the fourth category, which is the one I think is most interesting, is what I term a disruptive category. And what this category does, it says, hang on a second, what do we even mean by science and religion? Because it is very far from being self-evident, and too often people can talk past one another because your definition of science and my definition of science are fundamentally different. There is a demarcation problem in science about which disciplines actually qualify as scientific. And if we were working in German, for example, and talking about Wissenschaften, we would include many of the disciplines like history, which we naturally classify as humanities, but nonetheless draw on evidence and rational discussion and are open, maybe not empirical, but certainly rational dialogue. Peter Harrison's brilliant book, The Territories of Science and Religion, which you can't quite see the title of there, takes a historical look at this and says it is nonsensical to talk about science and religion having a long-standing antithesis because they didn't exist 200 years ago, let alone 1,000 years ago. People talked about natural theology or natural philosophy. People talked about divinity or theology, but religion is a concept that kind of was birthed in the 16th century and matured in the 17th and the 18th, and as we understand it today, and science latterly so. And so if we're talking about the relationship between the two, let's at least talk about it, how people in the 17th or 18th century talked about it. And I mentioned John's book there, and Ruth mentioned Elaine Howard Eklund, who's published a series of very good sociological study, which, as it were, brings this disruptive perspective right up to today and says, actually, what are people today, primarily in the US, although her most recent book, Science and Secularity, is a global study, how do people understand this relationship today? What I kind of want to do is be a bit disruptive in the next kind of half an hour or so. And the first way I want to disrupt is by talking about these two handsome gentlemen whom you might recognize, the combatants in possibly the greatest, certainly the most famous science versus religion conflict ever to have occurred in this country, where they weighed in Oxford in June 1860 at British advancement for the Association of Science debate, a few months after Darwin's The Origin of Species was published. Darwin was not present. He was in Down House because he had a nervous stomach and because he simply couldn't go up against people like Samuel Wilberforce. Darwin himself was very much a member of the establishment and felt physically sick at the prospect of being bested by a bishop in public. Thomas Henry Huxley on the right had no such qualms, popularly known as Darwin's bulldog. So he went up against Samuel Wilberforce, Soapy Sam Wilberforce as he was known, because he had this habit whenever he was speaking in public of looking as if he was washing his hands like that. Although doubtless as well, I think because he had a reputation of being a little bit slippery. And the one thing everybody knows about this particular debate is that at some point or other, Wilberforce said to Huxley something like, are you descended from an ape on your grandmother or your grandfather's side? And Huxley said something like, "I'd rather be descended from an ape than a bishop." Now, the problem is we didn't actually know what was said in this debate. The fullest account was published in the Athenaeum, a very establishment journal, a few weeks later, and there are half a dozen or so reports from people who were present in letters talking about this great debate. Until an eagle-eyed scholar noticed during the digitization of local newspapers that has been going on recently, a remarkably full account of this debate that was published in something like the Bucks and Oxfordshire Gazette. And fascinatingly, it was the account from which the Athenaeum's account was taken and then severely redacted. And you get to see why it was redacted when you read the full account. Because Wilberforce at one point says, glancing at Professor Huxley's remarks on the previous day in a discussion with Professor Owen, the bishop facetiously asked if he had any particular predilection for a monkey ancestry, and if so, on which side? Whether he would prefer an ape for his grandfather and a woman for his grandmother, or a man for his grandfather and an ape for his grandmother. And the lovely thing about this transcript is you have in brackets much laughter from the audience. This was moved to the library and the University Museum up Parks Road. It was the biggest building in Oxford they could find to host a debate. There were over 1,000 people over there. Some of the letters beautifully describe fragile Victorian ladies fainting. It was probably because it was too hot rather than because of what the bishop said. But nonetheless, this is a bishop of the established church saying, which of your grandparents had sex with an ape? That was a scandalous thing to say, and not surprisingly, the Athenaeum redacted it. That was not the kind of thing someone with the public authority of a bishop should say. And Huxley did come back, not immediately, because he didn't have a chance to come back immediately, but he said in reply to the bishop's query, he said that if the alternative were given him of being descended from a man conspicuous for his talents and eloquence, but who misused his gifts to ridicule the laborious investigators of science and obscure the light of scientific truth, or, from the humble origin alluded to, he would rather choose the latter than the former. Which is not quite the kind of punch, knockout blow of I'd rather be a monkey than a bishop, but actually somewhat more dignified, and actually, if, as it were, Wilberforce has gone low and Huxley's gone high there. And that is partly what's going on in this debate. You see, the word scientist was only coined in the 1830s by William Whewell. Up until then, they were clerical naturalists or natural philosophers, and it was people like Wilberforce, who was an intelligent, sophisticated and educated man, not the clerical bigot of the cartoon, who wrote a 40-page review of The Origin of Species that was published in the Athenaeum that Darwin himself called uncommonly clever. It was people like him who were dominating the scientific experience. He was the vice president of the BAAS on one occasion. Most of the vice presidents were clerics. Up until the mid-1850s, science was clerical. It would be done in rectories a lot of the time. Huxley was not like that. Huxley had to leave school at 10 years old. He had to fight his way up. He was very brilliant. He was an autodidact, and he was pugnacious. And there's a lovely story that he wanted promotion. He was going for a job at one point, and he needed the reference, as of course you had to have in Victorian Britain. And he asked for a reference from Professor Owen, whom had spoken the previous day. This was a number of years beforehand. Owen hadn't responded. And finally, by chance, Huxley had tracked him down in the street one day and stopped him. And Owen said to him, "Oh yes, I remember your request. I shall grant it." And Huxley wrote in a letter that it had to restrain myself from knocking him into the gutter at that moment. So patronising, so supercilious, so hoton basse was this establishment professor to me. That's kind of what's going on in Oxford in 1860. It's Thomas Henry Huxley punching clerical naturalism into the gutter and replacing it with authentic scientists. So it is no accident that later on he says, "I do protest against this subject being dealt with by amateurs in science and made the occasion of appeals to passion and feeling." That's partly because he knew that Wilberforce was simply playing to the crowd, but He doesn't want amateurs to be doing the science. That's a wholly commendable view. There's a small footnote to that Huxley was instrumental in forming the X Club, which was a group of a dining club of 9 Victorian gentlemen who were dedicated over the next 30 years to the professionalisation of science. And the professionalisation of science meant keeping clerics out of science. It also meant keeping women out of science. So, not a full hero by any means. But there is another thing going on in this debate, which I think is very important indeed. Wilberforce rejects evolution. He criticises it. He is, interestingly, prepared to recognise that evolution is possible in some plant species. But what really upsets him is this. Viewing the matter in another aspect, he did consider it a most degrading assumption, here, the audience says, that man, who in many respects partook of the highest attributes of God, was a mere development of the lowest forms of creation. He could scarcely trust himself to speak upon the subject, so indignant did he feel at the idea. This is not the language of a sober, balanced scientific response to a theory. This is emotional stuff. And the emotional stuff is, what are you doing to the dignity of humankind? What is at stake here is partly authority, who has the right to talk about this stuff, and partly humanity. What does all this stuff mean for human nature and human freedom and human morality and human destiny and the image of God in humanity? And Huxley recognises this, and it says at one point, with regards to the psychological distinction between man and animals, it must be remembered that man himself was once a monad, a mere atom of matter, in other words, in the womb. So he recognises that this is an issue and tries to say that you're not degrading human beings by saying that 3,000 generations ago you were a primate, because 30 years ago you were a monad, you were an atom. This is a way of saying, I guess this is the main point, I have other things to say, but over the years science and religion, anachronistically termed, have clashed on various different levels. When Aristotelianism was introduced into European universities at the end of the 13th century, 12th, 13th century, in Paris it was banned by the Bishop of Paris in 1277. It was accommodated, and the Thomist synthesis of Christian theology and Aristotle took a long time to get going, and for various reasons, partly because Aristotle postulated that the universe could have existed forever, and that was in tension with Christian doctrine of creation. There was a ban. It was a temporary ban. It was only in Paris, but there were tensions around that. We all know about the tensions of heliocentrism, which I'll come to at the moment. Ruskin once said in the 19th century, he wished to silence the hammers of the geologists who were tapping away at his faith. There have been disagreements about miracles or the existence of life elsewhere, but that has not been warfare. That have been skirmishes, if you like. The skirmishes you would expect for any live intellectual disciplines. As an aside, they've almost always been skirmishes between some scientists and other scientists, rather than religious people and scientists who fall into some kind of dual category. But in as far as there have been any ongoing tensions, they have been around this question of authority, who has the right to talk about these kind of things, and humanity. What do these things mean for human nature? And it's the human nature thing I find particularly interesting that I will come into land a bit later on. It is self-evidently the case that there have been scientists, great scientists, even paradigm-changing scientists, who have been deeply and sincerely believers, not simply because that happened to be the time in which they were born, because they genuinely saw in their science a reflection of and a glorification of their creator. Ruth mentioned Kepler earlier. Before him there's Copernicus, there's Galileo, there's Newton, there's Francis Bacon, there's Descartes, there's William Whewell, there's Michael Faraday, there's James Clerk Maxwell and Francis Collins, all of whom speak very sincerely about the impact that it wouldn't even be right to say the impact their faith had on science, because they were totally interwoven. That would suggest that there was one thing that another thing affected. They were totally interwoven. Francis Bacon is, broadly speaking, the originator of the scientific method as we know it, and coined, I don't think he did coin actually, but he probably popularized the metaphor of two books. And there is the book of creation and there is God's book, and you engage with them simultaneously because they complement one another. Isaac Newton, we're only just now, for the programme I did last year, I interviewed Robert Iliff, who's an academic in Oxford, who published a very good book on Newton. We're only now getting to know quite how much Newton wrote on theology, vastly more than he ever did on science, and considered himself to be a theologian, albeit a very eccentric one. He was basically an Arian. And he didn't publish this stuff because he was at Trinity, although he wasn't ordained. But he sincerely believed that his Principia was not a proof, but a strong evidence for his theological beliefs, and so on and so forth. I won't go through all of them. So just the very idea they've always been at war is nonsense. Having said that, there certainly have been fights, and one of the only fights that exceeds Oxford 1816 in its popularity has to do with Galileo, because we all know what happened with Galileo. He said that the Earth goes around the sun. The church didn't like it. They threatened to torture him, and he then said the Earth doesn't go around the sun. End of story. Well, I mean, as a bare facts of the case, that's not a bad way of putting it. But it does rather miss out on a lot of the details. Heliocentrism at the beginning of the 17th century was a minority position. Most people held to the Ptolemaic system still, although there were some alternative models on offer. It was faced by some genuine, severe scientific objections, not theological objections, scientific objections, namely the absence of what's called a stellar parallax. You should be able to see a change in the position of the stars if we are moving. The reason you can't is because they're very much further away than anyone could measure at the time. But no one thought that at the time. So if Copernicanism was going to be true, you should have seen the stellar parallax. You couldn't see the stellar parallax, therefore it wasn't true. So there was a genuine scientific objection. Galileo first published his ideas in 1610 in the Starry Messenger. He was a genuine and very sincere Catholic, and he was permitted to publish. But the restrictions placed on him were that it wasn't sufficient empirical evidence for this. Publish it as a theory rather than the facts. And if you publish again, talk about it theoretically. A number of years later, I think it was in 1623, a friend of his became Pope Urban VIII, and he thought, okay, I'm in with a chance here. I've got a man in the top. And he published in 1632 his dialogue concerning the two chief world systems. Urban had personally asked Galileo to give arguments for and against heliocentrism in his book, and to be careful not to advocate heliocentrism as a fact. And he also made another request that his own views on the matter should be included in Galileo's book. Galileo only acceded to the second of those papal requests. He didn't put both sides of the argument seriously, and he didn't discuss it simply as a mathematical theory. He did put Urban's views into the mouths of one of the characters in the dialogue. The character in the dialogue into whose mouth he put Urban's views was called Simplicio, which can be translated simpleton. Not the most diplomatic thing you could have done. You have to also remember there is immense pressure on the papacy because of the 30 Years' War and the ongoing conflict with Protestants at the time, and a huge amount of internal conflict within the Vatican at the time. This isn't to excuse what happened subsequently, and the fact that Galileo was threatened with torture unless he recanted. And then he was imprisoned, albeit in a villa in Tuscany, until he died. And what happened subsequently is that heliocentrism became impossible to teach in Catholic universities for another couple of 100 years or so. So it ended up as a disaster for science within Catholic countries and for Catholicism itself. But actually, so much of what's going on there is around the personalities. And it has often been said that had Galileo himself not been so very provocative, this could have been sorted out more amicably. Again, it's about authority. The third historical example, before I move on to the current issues that you will have heard about, is the Scopes monkey trial. So, if you like, continental Europe has their Galileo, we have our Wilberforce versus Huxley. The United States has the Scopes monkey trial. This is the trial in Dayton, Tennessee in 1925, when the biology teacher John Scopes was tried and convicted for teaching evolution. But it was famous, it was a massive media circus. And it's famous for various different reasons, but it's mainly famous because the two advocates there, William Jennings Bryan, who was counsel for the prosecution, and Clarence Darrow, who was counsel for the defence, ended up squaring off against one another on the last day of the trial. It was so hot they went outside, it was filmed, and Darrow, very unusually, almost uniquely in American jurisprudence, managed to get William Jennings Bryan to take the stand because they couldn't get any scientists who were Christians to defend young Earth creationism. And then he proceeded to humiliate Bryan because he clearly didn't know what he was talking about, and it was a shaming experience for American fundamentalism, which had quite a long-term effect. It's an interesting side fact that when the fundamentals were written in the early part of the 20th century, so the pamphlets from which fundamentalism takes its name, several of the original fundamentalists were Darwinians. Actually, their big beef at the time was not evolution, it was biblical liberalism. But it became evolution, and it partly became evolution because of this man, my namesake, Herbert Spencer, not, as far as I'm aware, any relative. Herbert Spencer coins the phrase survival of the fittest, and also invents what came to be known as social Darwinism, the logic of which is nature progresses by the weak dying off and not reproducing. That's how the world moves on. That is also how society moves on. So any attempts to preserve the lives of the poor and the weak and the vulnerable and the disabled are simply kicking against the goads of nature. Don't do it. As a doctrine, it didn't take off in Europe very much, but it was much more popular in the US, and he's a much better known figure in the US. And I think it's probably fair to say that if you are weak, vulnerable, disabled, that doctrine of social Darwinism probably has limited appeal to you. This at the same time as well, of course, as the world is plunged into a global conflict in 1914, which many people ascribe to a pseudo-evolutionary mentality amongst Germans that might is right. And just as a little example, and this is a pitifully painful one, this is the figure of Otto Benga, who's a 23-year-old Congolese pygmy who was taken to America and exhibited in the New York Monkey House in 1906. And the Baptist Coloured Ministers Association, I think, is writes publicly and says our race, I can't remember the exact quote, but it's something like our race has to suffer enough indignities without us being exhibited like animals in zoos. I paraphrase. But that was a logical thing to do. Early anthropologists saw a continuum of progression with primitive civilizations and races at one end and us at the other end. And if you treat human beings solely objectively, not as persons in any way, that's where it leads you. And the long-term result is that because of Scopes and because of Wilberforce and because of Galileo, you get the idea that somehow there is this absolute conflict here. The Onion, just in case you don't realize it, is a satirical newspaper, a satirical magazine, which asks, is science being taught in our schools? Should children be exposed to the facts? And this gives birth to the general attitude, or the public opinion, that there is a warfare between the two. As I said, John William Draper cements the two together in his history of the warfare of science and religion, which is a strongly anti-Catholic book primarily, but reads the entirety of the history through the lens of warfare and then says this is where we are today. Well, it's not really where we are today, actually, if you start doing the sociology on it. First thing to say is that, as Ruth mentioned earlier, we've done some work on this, and then Hannah, my colleague over there, and I are working in partnership with the Faraday Institute to try and bring up some of the UK research to the level of the US research, where there's much more done. But we have some research in the UK. This is from the Rescuing Darwin project I mentioned earlier, asking people their attitude to science and religion. Roughly speaking, half the people say it coexists. Roughly speaking, a quarter talk about non-overlapping magisteria, Stephen Jay Gould's famous phrase. They just don't engage with one another at all. 12% says it positively supports religious belief. 10% says it totally undermines, which is quite a low figure given how prevalent that narrative is. And also giving the lie to the idea that religious people are somehow anti-science or anti-scientists. Public attitude to science, a massive survey that goes on every 3 years or so, allows you to interrogate the data according to whether people are religious or not. That's a slightly vague variable, but we'll leave it. And it tends to find that with the exception of being less inclined to think that scientists are open-minded, religious people are slightly more inclined to think they're interesting, honest, ethical, creative, good at communicating and open. That's not a terrible thing. Religious people are actually more positive about scientists. And Elaine's work has this in much more detail and with great deal of sophistication, primarily in the US. Her study published about 3 years ago, Religion versus Science, What Religious People Really Think, found that, among other things, 31% of evangelicals believe that science and religion are in conflict with one another. That's high, but compared to 27% of the population, so it's not disproportionately so. 48% of evangelicals say their view on religion and science is being in collaboration with one another, as opposed to 38%, and that rises to 73% of evangelical scientists. The point about this is the US in some quarters certainly does have an issue here. It does have a cultural issue here, a culture war issue, but it's easy to get it out of proportion. When it comes to the UK, I think Amy's speaking tomorrow, isn't she? So she will probably give you much more detail on this, and she's kindly allowed us to look at to use some of her interesting data. Asked in a survey 5-6 years ago now, people's attitudes to science and religion, nothing to do with one another, non-overlapping magisteria at the top, incompatible in the middle. So I think that they're incompatible, and then many people in this country think they're incompatible. What's interesting about that is that, personally, 17% of us think they're incompatible. If you add on the strongly agree, 27%. It's a much higher figure than our Rescuing Darwin survey, interestingly. But when it comes to my impressions of what people generally think, 41%, half of the population overall, if you include the strongly agrees, think they're incompatible. And it's the same in the US. Most Americans say science and religion in conflict, but fewer say their own beliefs conflict with science. Generally thinking, do you think science and religion are often in conflict, 59%, mostly compatible, 38%? But when it comes to your own views, that's generally at the top, your own views at the bottom, does not conflict, is much higher. This, in other words, is a variation of what is sometimes known, at least by me, as the NHS problem. Nigel Lawson famously remarked, didn't he, that the NHS is the closest the English have to a religion. If you ask the general population, we saw that in spades with the election campaign last year, if you ask the general population what they think of the NHS in terms of how well it's doing, it's a pretty grim litany you get. You get long waiting lists, dirty hospitals, low morale amongst the staff, so on and so forth. Ask the same people in the same surveys, what is your experience of the NHS for your GP or outpatient, or possibly immediately one of your relatives? It's almost always much, much higher. So there is this cognitive dissonance between my own experience of something, which is actually not bad, and the impression I generally get that the stuff is much, much worse in general. Pollsters call this as the optimism gap, and it's the fact that we consistently overestimate the level of litter, vandalism, crime, drugs, teenage pregnancy, migration, refugees, because they're the things that worry about us, and they're the things we read on the front page of the newspapers. Or some of them. Science and religion suffers from the NHS problem. Why? Well, here's where you get an interesting feedback loop. Ipsos Mori and Eurobarometer for the last 30 years or so have asked this question periodically. We depend too much on science and not enough on faith. Extent to which people agree, disagree, or are uncertain. Now, the agree line goes from about 44%, saying too much science, not enough faith, down to 30% there. And the red line, disagree, oscillates a bit, but goes from 34 to 47. So the story there seems to be we're becoming, as a nation, we're less inclined to rely on faith and more inclined to rely on science. Well, that's interesting. But really? This question? Are you inclined to depend too much on science, not enough faith? Well, it rather depends what aspects of my life I'm talking about. There is a false choice here. These two are put in direct opposition with one another, and you have to choose one of them. Woe betide you if you walk into the lab and decide everything you're going to do that day, including the results, based on simply faith, whatever that is. Woe betide you if you enter into a marriage or a friendship and decide you're going to navigate the whole thing through science, whatever that might mean. Even more egregiously, this is the worst single example of it I've found. And I wouldn't say this example is not typical, but it is instructive. Survey 15 years ago, going through 3 different options. Can you tell me which of the following theories best describes your view? First, the evolution theory says that humankind has developed over millions of years from less advanced forms of life. God had no part in this process. I used to work for market research companies. You don't do that. You don't obfuscate a single statement by appending another statement, which is actually peripheral to the first statement, because what exactly am I supposed to be answering there? Evolution, but not evolution, because it is atheistic evolution fundamentally. Or the creationism theory, and this is a clear, narrow, young Earth creationism theory, last 10,000 years, or the intelligent design theory that says that certain features of living things are best explained by intervention of a supernatural being. When we did the Darwin survey, it is very difficult asking these questions to the general public. We actually ended up asking the same question from 4 or 5 different angles because fundamentally people haven't thought much about this and you need to kind of probe it. So I'm not ragging on the difficulty there is with this, but there is an agenda going on here. And not surprisingly, what you find is that the level of people who reject evolution, either with the creationism theory, intelligent design, is massively inflated. As Fern Elston Baker, who's an academic in Birmingham, talked about this. Look, if you ask people to choose fundamentally between their God and evolution, most people, even if they're evolutionists, will choose their God, because that's what actually matters to them. So you inflate the figures, and then what you do is you use it to make a program by Horizon, which is called A War on Science. Broadcast in 2006, the theory of evolution is under attack from a new, controversial new idea called intelligent design, but is it science? Well, no, is my answer to that particular question, but that's largely irrelevant because I have constructed a war here, which I then reporting, which millions of people who don't really think much about this issue in their day-to-day lives watch and say, yeah, I know why there's a conflict between I saw it on telly. So it becomes self-perpetuating like that. So that make sure I've got time for questions. I've just got a few more slides left. So there is this perception of warfare, and historically it's been constructed, and there have been skirmishes. But it has become self-fulfilling through bad research a lot of the time. But it's important just coming to end, recognising, going back to this point about humanity, because I think this is probably the most interesting one, and the one that we're going to be exploring in more detail in the project. Fern's project exploring the spectrum from a few years back asked a whole battery of questions, and one of which it then asked of people who said they rejected evolutionary science. What do you find difficult about evolutionary science? Now you can see that 15% of people really object to the fact that plants have evolved. I mean, even Wilberforce was okay with that one. But first, humans have evolved. Second, a very similar point, you could argue, humans and apes share a common ancestor. A third, similarly, the common origin of all life, including humans, from single cells, is a thing I object to. What is going on there is an attitude to humanity. And I think if you had to crystallise where the tension lies, and I do this with some reservations, because in conversations with Peter Harrison and John and others, they repeatedly emphasise don't essentialise the debate. if religion and science are multivarious things, don't say it's only about one thing. And I agree with that. But science as a process requires a degree of, requires objective assessment. You withdraw yourself from the process, your opinion, and try to assess whatever you are assessing as objectively as you can. And that's one of the reasons why it has to be a public activity, because no one can do that fully. So if other people withdraw themselves as well, you get closer to a view from nowhere. And that works. It works very, very well. It has completely transformed the world over the last 300 or 400 years or so. There are problems with it. It's naturally a very reductionist process, method, and it doesn't quite work as well when you deal with emergence and properties that come into existence at a certain level when things are brought together. But broadly speaking, it works very well. And it works very well up to and including human beings. I want my doctor to take that approach to me when I go and visit her. But if you appropriate it and then use it to study other cultures and study human beings altogether and say this is the only way you can conceivably understand human beings, you end up putting Otter Benga in the monkey sanctuary because you view him as an object, not as a subject, not as a person. There are other ways of knowing, and we do it all the time in our lives, which are exactly the opposite to that scientific epistemology, which is you give yourself to other people. How do you become friends with somebody? You don't become friends with somebody by withholding absolutely everything about yourself until they have proved themselves worthy of being your friend, let alone in any romantic relationship, let alone in a divine relationship. That is personal knowledge. It is knowledge of self-giving, and that is how you deal with people. Not how you deal with the material world, because you end up with seeing, as it were, sprites behind every oak tree. But it is how you deal with people. And it is interesting that science works very well with stuff, and the personal works very well with humans, but humans are both stuff and personal. And that's why people conflict. That's why, as it were, the battle line, such as it is, comes to rest on the question of the human. And it's how it manifests itself in or can manifest in the culture war. So despite the fact that religious believers tend to be a little bit more positive about scientists, they also are more inclined to say science makes our way of life change too fast. The speed of development in science and technology means they cannot be properly controlled by the government. The more I know by science, more I know about science, the more I'm worried I am. Scientific advances tend to benefit the rich more than the poor. I don't really know what science does. People shouldn't tamper with nature. I don't understand the point of science. There's a degree of reservation there among the scientific activity because there is a sense that there is a givenness within creation, a divine order within creation, which we can modify, but we should do so more cautiously. There shouldn't be such a gung-ho attitude to it. So fascinatingly, when you measure people's understanding of the benefits and risks of different sciences according to whether they're religious or non-religious, religious are more inclined to see the benefits of vaccinating people against disease, but they're much more nervous about synthetic biology and stem cell research and GM crops and nuclear power to some extent as well. A reservation of tinkering with, as it were, the reality of the stuff, the givenness of the stuff. I want to end with Martin Buber, the Jewish philosopher, whose beautiful quote says, "When we encounter another individual truly as a person, not as an object, we become fully human." I think that's as profoundly and deeply true, and intuitively I think people recognise that. And it's when we get confused about those different ways of knowing, and we start to accord different values to the human, which then spins out into the value you accord modifying the human, that's when these things can spin out of control into genuine kind of culture wars. But there's absolutely nothing intrinsic there that's a culture war. But conversely, because these are live, active ways of engaging with reality, you would expect there to be skirmishes, because in any healthy intellectual discipline, there are always points of tension and disagreement. That's effectively how knowledge moves on. I think I'll stop there. Thank you.
Well, a very stimulating and engaging talk. I'm sure you have some questions for our speaker. Julia will give you hers.
You kind of blamed Galileo slightly for the fact that he ended up being so resisted. Surely religious people also bear some of the blame for suggesting that religious faith isn't developmental, that it's static and therefore can be directly challenged by science.
Yep.
Whereas surely
Absolutely. So that's one of the skirmishes, if you like. There's a very interesting theory about why did science develop in Europe and not in the Middle East or in China. It's known as the Needham question from Joseph Needham, who who published a massive series of books on science and civilization in China. And one of the arguments is that science is fundamentally it's actually quite threatening because, as Ruth said at the beginning, it's always provisional. It's always asking questions. If you are in any position of cultural or political or social authority or intellectual authority, that is inherently threatening. And so one of the suggestions about why science develops in Europe in the Middle Ages as it does in the Middle Ages is because of universities. Because of the legal reforms of the 12th century create such a thing as a corporate entity which effectively doesn't owe its existence directly to the supporting authorities, and you can do this kind of threatening question asking there, and that incubates science for several hundred years or so. I think it's a good theory. It's a long way from being proven, but it's the flip side to your point that very often when religious people are in positions of authority, intellectually, theologically, socially, science does become threatening. And there's a lovely example of, so William Buckland was one of the early geologists in the 19th century. He was an academic at Oxford, one of the first people to put forward the idea that the Earth certainly wasn't made a few thousand years ago, but could be hundreds of thousands, possibly millions of years old. Very early science. This is in the 1820s or so. His widow, I think her name was Mary, made a comment in the 1850s. He obviously died by then, saying, my poor husband would have been dragged to the stake had he been making his theories today rather than the 1820s. And the point she was making is that what had happened between the 1820s and 1850s with the evangelical revival, which take a much more rigidly literalistic view of the scriptures, Buckland can get away with talking more generally about Genesis in the 1820s. It'd be much harder in the 1850s. So absolutely, I don't want to excuse religious people, religious cultures, religious institutions for sometimes, particularly if they're feeling a bit defensive, pulling down the shutters.
Yes, here we are.
Thank you. Could I sort of add something to that, which is that actually I think, if I may say so, you're not quite right about the earlier development, that actually Islamic science was really highly developed, more so than European, up to about the year 1000 or thereabouts AD. And that, but you are absolutely right that what then happened was that the mullahs, as it were, brought down the shutters and said, look, all this investigation is questioning the actions of God in creating what He's created. We must not investigate this. This is quite wrong, and so that's put an end to that. And then later there was the European development that you've described.
I think that's right. I would add a kind of coda to that. Those skeptical, so anti-scientific, anachronistically, Islamic theological attitudes had existed from beforehand into the 9th and even at the end of the 8th century. And they're always in coexistence. And you're right in that at some point, I don't think it was as early as 1000, might have been 100 or so years after that, that more constrictive attitude takes priority. And from the Islamic cultures having been scientific world leaders in about 1200, they fall away. There was actually one really important coda to this, and that one of the people I interviewed for the radio program, who's a specialist in this area, says, actually, we don't know. There's vast amounts of Islamic scientific scientific activity that conducted in Islamic cultures between 1200 and 1400 that simply hasn't been analysed yet. This is still quite an early era. So I think that's right. He objected, and I can see his point of view, that there is sometimes a narrative which says it's like that the Muslims started it off, and then we took the baton from it, and then we really finished the race. So I think you're right. I also think there's a lot more work to be done in that area.
Okay.
A lot of the comparisons and questions about science and religion, of course, your topic. I was very pleased to be invited to a humanist society meeting in Stockport, as it turns out, and they would portray themselves as people who would answer all those questions about being human and reasonable, and they recognise that science doesn't answer everything. Could you comment on the differential between the humanist view and the religious, or the people who believe in God?
How long have you got? I'm a humanist. I'm a Christian humanist. I sincerely hope everybody in the room is a Christian humanist. Humanism was a thoroughly ecumenical movement right up until the post-war period. What was the precursor to Radio 3, whatever it was, broadcast in 1944? 3 programs, one on classical humanism, one on secular humanism, one on Christian humanism. The greatest humanist book of the first half of the 20th century was Jacques Maritain Integral Humanism, 1936. Humanism, as an understanding of human value, has very deep Christian roots. In the post-war period, it's effectively been hijacked to mean non-religious or anti-religious. They can do that. I don't have a problem with that, but they do get very upset with me if I call myself a Christian humanist, despite the fact I try to explain why. People accuse me of trolling them. I'm not entirely anyway. But a second point is that sometimes it's difficult to pin down what humanists actually mean by humanism. The best definition is the International Humanist and Ethical Union definition from 2002, which goes through 7 different, it's almost like a creed, funny that, and it says what humanism is, and it has various different things. And 3 really critical ones are: there is an inherent dignity to human nature, there is a commitment to some kind of moral realism, although they don't quite put it that way, and there's a commitment to human rationality, as in the human brain is capable of genuinely tracking the truth. And I co-wrote a piece about 5 years ago, which you can download on our website, called The Case for Christian Humanism, which says each of those things is much easier to sustain, brackets can only really be sustained, on a Christian worldview. I'm not questioning the fact that secular humanists are moral people for a second, or they have a commitment to human dignity. But I think it is almost impossible to sustain a serious commitment to human dignity, rationality and moral realism without, at very least, a theistic worldview. So in many ways, we should be fellow travellers in a commitment to that, to the human. But unfortunately, it has increasingly, in certainly the last 2 generations, been used to mean anti and non-religious. And my view of that is not to cede that ground, but to try and reclaim the name.
Julia, there's a question here.
So coming to the point about surveys which you made, particularly in America, have there been any surveys which have asked the question about belief in evolution using proper questions, as it were? And if not, why not?
Yes is the short answer, and then the inevitable quibbles come in what is the proper view. The report that Ruth mentioned that we put together last year, called Science, Religion, Perils of Misperception, lists pretty much every time that's been asked in the UK in the last 10 years or so. We've asked it, Fern has asked it, Amy has asked it, a few British social attitudes have asked it. It can be asked well. A lot of it depends on the number and the range and the language of the options that are given. And there is a kind of catch-22 here, which is when you're dealing with quantitative surveys like this, you've got to make them simple, because you're dealing with the general public. But simplicity comes at the expense of nuance. You want more nuance and complexity, it becomes more difficult for people to answer, and easy you can show that people didn't even understand the question in the first instance. So there have been questions and answers, and there are therefore data on those questions, and you can read them all there. What we found in Rescuing Darwin 10 years ago is that there are roughly 25% of people in this country who are consistent and coherent in their adherence to evolution. There are roughly 25% of people in this country who are consistent in and coherent in their rejection of evolution. There are 50% of people in the middle who are just generally quite confused by the issue. And what you will no doubt notice there is that 25% vastly outnumbers the people who might be darkening a church door on a Sunday morning. So this is not simply a religious issue. When you have hardcore Darwinians saying that evolution is not a theory to understand the development of different species, but it fundamentally disproves the reality of human morality, human freedom, human consciousness, not surprisingly, people think, if that's what evolution is, I'm not interested. As soon as it shifts from becoming a very well-attested scientific theory to a fundamentally metaphysical position, that's when problems arise.
Can I just add that Amy that Nick speaks of is Amy Unsworth, who is speaking on the programme tomorrow afternoon. So there's a bit more depth that we can go to there. Okay, other questions?
Is it dangerous to talk about, say that the spiritual world is as authentic as the physical world? What I'm thinking is that science and religion are both philosophies, whereas when you start separating the spiritual world as distinct from the scientific world, you're sort of outside philosophy?
So I don't think it's dangerous. I think it's actually very helpful to talk about different worlds. Maps are a very good illustration of this. We exist in the same world together, and yet mysteriously we can have very different maps of the same world. We can have it. We can have a physical geographical map, you can have a political map, you can have a rainfall map, you can have demographic maps. It's the same reality. You're just engaging with it at different levels, as it were, and they're not in contravention with one another. And I would argue that that is perfectly legitimate to talk about different ways of particularly understanding the human, which is, I think, at the core. There is a perfectly legitimate genetic, biological, evolutionary way of understanding humans. There's a physical way, as in based on physics. There's a chemical understanding, but that doesn't invalidate a sociological or an anthropological or indeed a spiritual understanding of the human. So I think that's perfectly legitimate. What you do have to be slightly careful about is what are you therefore meaning. So if I were to talk about a spiritual understanding of the human, I would talk about our yearning for God and everything as attendant. Our hearts are restless until they rest in you, as Augustine said. If you're talking about a spiritual understanding of the world, you might be heard to say all manner of things about demigods or angels or demons or whatever else that you don't actually mean. So I think it's perfectly right to talk about it, but you need to be clear what precisely you're talking about when you're talking about it.
Okay, one question here at the front. Oh, okay, we're going.
Not yet. You can wait for 5 minutes, please.
The gentleman at the back, and then finally the gentleman at the front.
On your surveys, and forgive me, it looked as though you were saying on I think it was the American survey, that if you ask the general population, can you reconcile science and faith, it was about 40%. If you ask, I think your definition was evangelical scientists, I think it was the slide before that one. Then 70, that one.
Yeah.
So if you ask evangelical scientists, that rises to 73%, so you can reconcile it. So my question is, what about the other 27%? And does that mean that that's 27% of American evangelical scientists who are struggling to reconcile it, who ignore the problem, who have different ways of reconciling it? Do we know anything about that group?
There might be some more detail in Elaine's book. I will put money that it is, I'm not caricaturing any particular scientific discipline here, hear me, it is engineers who have problems with evolution.
Okay, right.
Not just engineers, but it is scientists. It's not, the problem will be I have a problem with evolution. I happen to work in engineering or another scientific discipline, and I don't have a problem with science, generally speaking, but I do have a problem with evolution, and if evolution is science, so I suspect it's that.
Right. Okay, and a final question here at the front.
So, how do you feel about the future running of this conflict in the light of what, to my grumpy old man point of view, is the rise of authorities and the media who are deliberately manipulating this dichotomy, playing fast and loose with the truth and with science and with religion for whatever ends?
Well, that's a tiny one to end on, isn't it? I should precede this question by saying I'm not temperamentally an optimist, so just bear that in mind. Okay. In the interviews that Hannah and I have done so far in this project, and in my general reading of this subject, one of the messages that does come across very clear is the desire for atheists, agnostics, secular humanists, secularists, many of them, to distance themselves from the new atheist phenomenon. Where was it? Hannah quoted it, I think, in an article she wrote about how... Oh, yes, Mullane's work, that's right, about the number of people that brought up Richard Dawkins' name. Atheists, scientists brought up Richard Dawkins' name and kind of said, not in my name. So that was an issue. It's less of an issue now, and it was partly a political issue. It was no accident that it happened in the mid-2000s. I have a genuine sense that the militancy you will find everywhere online, because that's kind of where militant people just gravitate a lot of the time, below the line. But it's less of a feature in serious and respected debate. That does not mean that people are all of a sudden flooding back saying, actually, I realise how these two work together, and there's an argument that's being replaced by indifference again. But I see that, you know, that was peak Dawkins, that was peak New Atheism, and we're living in a slightly different, a bit more nuanced, a bit more thoughtful environment. There you go. It's an optimistic answer from a pessimist. You can't do better than that, can you?
Okay, we're going to take a break now, but let's thank Nick again for a great talk.